Welcome back to our world and the spring of 1954. In America, we have that spring broken the back of polio and the record of big bombs. The Salk vaccine and the hydrogen bomb both reshape our world. There were small doings afoot as well. The first transistor radio and the very first American two-seater sports car, the Corvette. Remember? Some sport.
Some car. Roger Bannister, some runner. He did something in the spring of 1954 that has been done hundreds of times since and done better, but he was the first.
To break a barrier, there must first be a barrier. The 4-minute mile was one. They said it couldn't be broken. But that spring in England, Roger Bannister, a 25-year-old medical student, ended the debate once and for all in 3 minutes, 59 and 4/10 seconds.
There was a great barrier that the 4-minute mile was never going to be run. And here was this very well-educated, gentlemanly, I think it was Cantabrigian or Oxford guy. And he was everything you wanted in a sportsman. And he broke the barrier, and we created out of that the Sportsman of the Year concept. And he was our first Sportsman of the Year, and he was exactly what we wanted.
Ezra Bowen wrote for a brand new magazine, Sports Illustrated.
Well, I arrived at Sports Illustrated in '54. They put out one dummy practice issue, and it was very cheerful and full of energy, and I think Madison Avenue was a bit bewildered by it. They weren't sure that there could be a vehicle for sport, and for a long time it didn't look as though there were going to be. I think in 10 years we lost about 20 million bucks, and I think if Mr. Luce hadn't been running the store, they'd have closed it down.
Hey there, you with the stars in your eyes.
He said, this is the direction that America is going to go. And America is going to fall in love with sport, and we are going to be the journal of sport.
Henry Luce was right, but first some other barriers would have to come down.
The common problem we had was dealing with superstar athletes and telling them we're with a magazine that has no name. And you say, well, I'm with Minorques. That was our dummy name.
Mark Kaufman, one of the first photographers to realize that the new form required new technology.
The whole point of the photography we were trying to do in Sports Illustrated was to get the reader really involved in the action, so that when they got in this new magazine every week, they would look forward to being able to see these people in an intimate way that they couldn't, even if they'd been at the event themselves. Well, to do that, we had to devise some equipment. So I had a couple of people together, and we came up with this thing. It revolutionized sports photography, this thing did. And you wound it up like a clock, like that, and off it went. Bang, bang, bang. One of the problems I had was this noise, as you could hear this thing clunk away, and I had to cover the Masters tournament in the spring of 1954. And I was taking pictures of Ben Hogan and Sam Snead, and you can imagine doing that when the guy's ready to putt. So I got dirty looks, so I stopped right away. We were working under very primitive circumstances, but we pulled it off. We pulled it off.
You with the stars in your eyes.
Come on, let me in.
Talk about distractions. We were spending 5 hours a day that spring watching television.
Do you know the password? Listerine enzyme toothpaste. Come on in, friend. Thank you, boy.
Home, sweet home, the little nest, where after work a man can rest.
Take it easy, dear. Relax.
Mabel, Black Label, Black Label.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.
Hello, Mary.
Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him two lips like roses and clover. And tell him that his lonesome nights are over.
Haven't we had some wonderful anniversaries?
Yes, we have.
And the wonderful thing about it is that we wouldn't have had nearly as many of them if we hadn't been married as long as we have.
Yeah, well, that's true about a lot of people.
Oh, no, it may seem like a lot of people, but we're only married to each other.
Give him a lonely heart like Pagliacci, and lots of wavy hair like Liberace.
The big entertainment news on TV that spring was not a breakthrough, but a putting to rest. After 4 years, your show of shows folded, leaving a big empty spot in Saturday night. The expense of a weekly live show had become just too high for its sponsors. Its incomparable stars were Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca.
There was no thinking about, is she going to give me the cue, or is she going to say this, or is she going to go here, is she going to pick up that, or is she going to do this? Because all these things go through your mind at 1 trillion miles a second. But I knew there was like none of that. So I could focus more of my attention and more of my energy on the performance.
Pick a language. Caesar, Coca, and Carl Reiner could speak it like a native of Brooklyn.
When the show finished, when it went off the air, there was a terrible sense of loss.
I felt it, yes.
The family had gone.
That's right. We could have gone on for years and years and years, truly. Many more years.
I agree.
In the spring of 1954, RCA marketed the first color television sets. They cost about $1,000. Most of us stuck with black and white. For color, we could eat, for the first time, a TV dinner. Swanson put it out. ABC, which had almost no network daytime programming, took a gamble and put on a Senate hearing live. It turned out to be a morality play that held America spellbound.
For 36 days in spring, television showed the real-life soap opera of Senator Joe McCarthy and his search for communists in the United States Army. Here's the background. In 1950, the flamboyant junior senator from Wisconsin made headlines when he claimed to have a list of 205 communists in the State Department. That intensified a wave of anti-communism, which McCarthy rode as he looked for Reds in the government and finally in the Army. The Army-McCarthy hearings offered the TV audience a first-class course in American civics and power politics. McCarthy's confidence in his own power led him to treat even other senators with contempt.
Mr. Symington, I think, and I'm glad we're on television, I think the millions of people can see how low that a man can sink. I repeat, they can see how low an alleged man can sink.
A lot of things were going through my head at that time.
Senator Stuart Symington, a member of the Senate subcommittee, had serious questions about McCarthy's tactics.
The whole atmosphere at the time was one of growing apprehension, one might say fear, of what the government of the United States was all about.
Say that he tried to improperly influence you. Now, if he said something that was improper, we should know what he said.
McCarthy's main target was Secretary of the Army Robert Stevens. He kept Stevens on the stand, badgering him for nearly 2 weeks.
An honest account. That's right. Some of my friends don't agree with that, I may say. I might add myself as one of those.
There wasn't any question about it. It was, in a sense, a witch hunt.
McCarthy and his counsel, Roy Cohn, had been hunting in vain for communists in the Army until the Army got fed up, and it refused to commission Private G. David Shine, Cohn's good friend, who had been getting all kinds of special privileges. McCarthy attacked. To defend itself, the Army brought in a civilian, a lawyer from Boston, Joseph Welch. Welch's young assistant was James St. Clair.
And at or about the time we entered, Senator McCarthy and those working with him entered the room, at which time there was loud applause. No one had even spoken to us, so that the emotional atmosphere was clearly in favor of Senator McCarthy.
My point of order is that Mr. Jenkins yesterday...
The atmosphere changed 4 days later when Welch showed that McCarthy had doctored evidence. A group photograph that included Shine and Army Secretary Stevens had been cropped to show Stevens and Shine apparently alone, implying that Stevens tried to use Shine to get McCarthy to call off the dogs.
That what was offered in evidence yesterday was an altered, shamefully cut down picture so that somebody could say to Stevens, were you not photographed alone with David Shine, when the truth is he was photographed in a group.
Mr. Chairman, the point of order is this, that Mr. Welch, under the guise of making a point of order... as
McCarthy had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and now he was on the defensive.
I may say yesterday was the first time I saw either of these pictures.
They had cut somebody out of the picture, which wrecked their story about it. And at one point, we had to just sort of rise up and protest the way the hearings were going.
In all the years that I have been in this government, based on the testimony that's been given before this committee under oath, I think the files of what you call my staff, my director, my chief of staff, have been the sloppiest and most dangerously handled files that I have ever known of since I've been in the government.
Mr. Chairman, now you can run away if you like to. You have been here trying to smear the staff of this committee.
At one point, I walked out of the hearing. I only walked out because, frankly, I was getting nervous about the nature of the hearings. I thought they were pushing too hard.
McCarthy did push too hard in the case of Fred Fisher, a young lawyer from Welch's firm. Asked by Jim St. Clair to be a member of the Welch staff at the hearings, Fisher said he'd once been a member of the Lawyers Guild, a group labeled subversive by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Knowing this information could make the defense team vulnerable to attack by McCarthy and possibly destroy Fisher's career, Joe Welch chose to send the young attorney home to Boston. Fisher never took part in the hearings, but McCarthy knew about Fisher, and when the hearings did not go well for McCarthy, he used Fisher in an attempt to discredit Welch.
He has in his law firm a young man named Fisher.
Mr. Welch was a very fair person, and he figured this was very unfair. Not only unfair, but unnecessarily damaging. That's how he felt, and he's a very articulate guy, and he knows how to express his feelings.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me.
I think that more than irritated Joe Welch, it made him very, very angry.
If there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cohen any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.
After that defense of Fred Fisher, the entire auditorium broke into a loud applause. And I can remember thinking, what a change has taken place. When we first walked in here, they couldn't even find us a chair. And when Senator McCarthy walked in, there was loud applause. Now, however, the loud applause comes down on our side.
Honor had been restored to the Army, and on June 17th, 1954, the McCarthy hearings went off the air.
It's a great illustration of democracy at its best. The good part about the hearings was that at the end it proved conclusively that the government was all right, that there was no communist menace, you might say.
You jump up and run away without answering the question. I have asked you a simple question.
So, the legislative branch of government finally broke the shackles of Joe McCarthy. Come back to the spring of '54, when the Supreme Court broke the shackles of segregated schools.
In a moment, our world continues. Breaking Barriers, 1954.
Headache, pressure, and congestion all together. Major symptoms of sinus complex. You need to feel better, but not drowsy. You need Sinutab 2 no drowsiness formula, so you feel altogether better.
When the burning, itching, and soreness of hemorrhoids flare up, Tux medicated pads give you soothing, cooling relief on contact. For hemorrhoid flare-up, get Tux from Park Davis.
Dear Linda, hope you can make my concert tonight. Love, Michael.
Nothing less than finesse.
Tonight, your hair has to look its best, and it will. You use Finesse.
Feel
Luxe Conditioner. The perfect conditioning whether your hair needs a little or a lot.
Nothing less than finesse.
Now, Oldsmobile makes it possible to save up to $1,675 during the greatest option sale in Olds history. Save as much as $1,200 on Calais, Cutlass Sierra, Delta 88, and Cutlass Supreme. Add a popular option package to that, and you could save up to $1,400. Even $1,675 on a Cutlass Supreme. The more you get, the more you save. Up to $1,675 during the Great Olds Option Sale. See your participating Olds dealer today for details and save.
Saturday. Only he can protect her.
Life requires you to make a stand.
At Marita is O'Hara. Then drop in on Boston's finest. Spencer for hire. Right after O'Hara.
Saturday. Welcome back to the spring of 1954. A kid could buy anything on the Good Humor Man's wagon that spring for under 15 cents. Same price for black kids and white kids. Equal, you might say. But when the Good Humor Man parked in front of a school, all his customers might be one color or the other. 17 states required segregated schools. 4 states in the District of Columbia allowed them. Separate but equal, the law said. That spring, 9 old men in Washington would say the law was wrong.
Some barriers fall with a giant crash, as polio did. Others are whittled away, stone by stone, until the light from the other side begins to shine through. In the spring of '54, the sound of crumbling stone could be heard in Topeka, Kansas, and on television.
I'm your school bell, ding dong ding. Boys and girls all hear me ring.
Ding Dong School was one of our most popular children's shows. It was a classroom that, through television, welcomed all children at a time when real classrooms did not. In 1954, segregation was the order of the day.
I had playmates of all nationalities that I played with. But when school starts, we have to go to separate schools.
Linda Brown was a 3rd grader at the all-black Monroe School.
My mother would try very gently to explain it to me. She would put her arm around me and say, well, dear or sweetheart, it's because of the color of your skin that you cannot go to school with your playmates. And I would say, well, why?
Linda Brown's mother had to answer.
I was sad. I felt very sad that I had to tell her this, but somebody had to tell her, and it had to come from her parents.
Linda's mother and her father were not eager pioneers, but the white school was nearby, the black school far away, and when the NAACP decided to do something about it, the Browns volunteered. Topeka lawyer Charles Scott.
We would have to get some sort of a tangible evidence that a black parent escorted his or her child to the school to be admitted, and the principal at that school or one of the officials there would refuse enrollment.
I remember the school being very large, the steps being very tall, and we walked inside. My father spoke with the secretary and said he was there to enroll his child. She immediately went inside and got the principal.
Being a company man, I followed board policy.
Frank Wilson, principal of the all-white Sumner School.
I knew that I was going to say your attendance area is not Sumner, but is whatever Monroe, as I recall. And they knew that I was going to refuse their enrollment. And that was the opening scene of the play.
My husband, as I said, was very much upset, and he said that together with the NAACP, they were going to file a suit against the Board of Education here in Topeka.
We filed the school case on for the purpose of doing away with the separate but equal doctrine. It was a novel situation, and we didn't know exactly how the court would react.
The Browns lost the case in the Topeka Federal Court, which ruled that Topeka's segregated schools provided equal facilities for blacks and whites and were therefore legal under the old separate but equal doctrine. The NAACP brought the Brown case and 4 similar ones to the Supreme Court, which had established the separate but equal doctrine in 1896. The cases languished here for nearly a year and a half because the narrowly divided court wanted unanimity on an issue as sensitive as this. And finally, it got it. In an opinion written without dissent by the new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, the Supreme Court declared that segregated educational facilities are inherently unequal. On that day, the court delivered on the inside what it promises on the outside.
I was at home that day in May 1954 when I heard that the Supreme Court had handed down the decision to outlaw segregation in the school. Oh, and I was so happy. Tears ran down my face as I did the ironing, and I could not hardly wait until the children got home from school so that I could tell them about it.
I do remember coming home that day in May and my mother sharing with me what she had heard on the radio that day about the decision being handed down in favor of desegregation of schools. I remember my father coming home and seeing tears of joy in his eyes and him saying, "Thanks be to God."
I see.
It was a constitutional milestone and a moment long overdue in the land of the free. Come back to Our World for the consequences of the Acts of Spring, 1954.
Our World continues in a moment.
3 years they've been training for one race and one goal: to bring home the cup. Budweiser is proud to have sponsored Dennis Conner and the crew of the Stars and Stripes in their quest to bring the America's Cup home from Australia.
A long way from home, but you're not alone, 'cause your country's hopes are sailing with you. You make America work, and this fight's for you.
You're really on the move from coast to coast, so you need a bank that can keep pace with you. Well, only First Interstate has day and night tellers all over the West and is part of Cirrus. So you can get cash instantly, coast to coast. So come to First Interstate. We're not just keeping pace, we're setting the pace.
The president's spokesman is leaving, but Barbara Walters got Larry Speaks to speak out.
This job probably has the greatest screw-up potential of any job in the world.
Watch 2020 tonight.
Well, rock and roll, Sports Illustrated, and color television, all born in the spring of 1954, certainly have thrived. Polio is virtually extinct. Senator Joe McCarthy is long since gone, and his deceit and cynicism with him, although no successful politician today dare be colored red. And segregated schools, they're still here, even in Topeka.
The concept of having totally desegregated schools has not come about after 35 years.
Linda Brown is still fighting the Topeka School Board. Brown versus the board was reopened to see if the school board actually did what the court told it to do, desegregate. There were 4 weeks of testimony before a U.S. District Court judge. The decision is pending, but de facto segregation remains an American fact.
Dr. Salk's inoculations of a dead polio virus paved the way for Dr. Albert Sabin's orally administered live virus. In 1954, 38,000 people contracted polio. Last year, there were less than 10. Now there's a new plague, AIDS. It's killing people at the rate of 25 a day, and no vaccine in sight. Yet.
As long as I continue to dig communists out of government.
6 months after the Army-McCarthy hearings ended, the Senate voted to censure Senator Joe McCarthy, ending his red baiting, his political career, and some of the trouble he made. Almost 20 years later, another set of televised hearings would rock the government. Once more, Attorney James St. Clair played a major role, this time defending President Richard Nixon in Watergate.
Rock lyrics have turned from "I can't get no satisfaction" to "I'm going to force you at gunpoint to eat me alive."
Concerned parents, congressional committees, the sexually explicit, violent lyrics of today's rock and roll have caught the attention of adults in a way the music never did. As for the youth of America, rock and roll is no longer their subculture, it's their culture.
The hydrogen bomb. They called it the cheapest form of destruction known to man, and they were right. The Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the U.S. agreed in 1963 to stop testing bombs above ground, but not underground. Last year, the U.S. exploded 13 nuclear bombs underground. This year, 6 underground tests are scheduled to be detonated. The bomb is here to stay.
Well, there it is, the way it was in the spring of 1954. We were intimidated enough by that big bomb to curb, if not eliminate, our appetite for nuclear weapons. We paid less attention that spring to a voice warning us about conventional war fought in an unconventional way. The French were under siege that spring at Dien Bien Phu, fighting and losing their war in Vietnam. A French journalist quoted in Time magazine said, "Everyone demands that we fight on out here. But there is something about Asian wars these days. They cannot be won in the old ways. You cannot win unpopular wars. We are up against something too big," end quote.
Sometimes unpopular wars are won only through the courts. That is what law is for. It would be pleasant to say that we weren't a nation that bullied its black people. It would be pleasant, but not true. In 1954, we were that bully. In the spring of 1954, what was true in Topeka, Kansas, was true throughout most of this country. In Chicago, it took close to 1,000 policemen to protect one black family, the Howard family. They had the audacity to qualify and move into a previously all-white project. Mrs. Howard was stoned as she left church. The stones were thrown by people who had also been in the church for services. One night, white teenagers skulked around the Howard apartment. A cop turned to one. "Why aren't you home watching Arthur Godfrey on TV?" The teenager spat on the sidewalk. "It's a free country, isn't it?" Yes, and no, and so it goes. Also in the spring of 1954,
on April 4th, Arturo Toscanini conducted his final concert.
gangster Frank Costello was sentenced to 5 years in prison for tax evasion.
Pope Pius X was canonized, becoming Saint Pius X.
On April Fool's Day, President Eisenhower authorized the building of an Air Force Academy.
Pajama Game opened on Broadway.
Audrey Hepburn won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Roman Holiday.
Johnny Carson made his network debut as host of Earn Your Vacation, a game show.
Archaeologists uncovered the tombs of the Pharaoh Cheops near the Great Pyramid. It was 5,000 years old.
Linda Ellerbee played third base for the 4th grade softball team at River Oaks Elementary School in Houston. Her batting average was not recorded. For the Our World Viewer Guide, write to Community Relations, ABC, 1330 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10019.
For a transcript of this broadcast, send $3 to Our World Transcripts, 2 John Street, New York, New York, 10038.
Americans talk about America.
It makes you want to think. It scares you. It could really happen.
I think it opens our eyes, I think, to a lot of the things that goes on here in America.
It's something that I think that every American ought to see.
America, starting February 15th.
An ABC News business brief. Now from New York, Dan Kortz.
Good evening. The U.S. will not impose steep tariffs on European cheese and wine after all. The administration said today it has settled a dispute with the common market that prompted the threat. But the government failed to win freer access to Japan's computer and construction markets. Japan did agree to stop dumping semiconductor chips in the U.S. And the president's new economic report predicts the U.S. trade deficit will fall 20% this year. December orders for non-defense durable goods showed their biggest increase in 4 years. Ross Perot has joined forces with Apple founder Stephen Jobs, investing $20 million in Jobs' new computer company. The nation's money supply fell last week. And finally, Coca-Cola is changing its formula for cherry Coke because of consumer suggestions. On New York financial markets, the Dow fell 3 points, interest on T-bills edged upward, gold rose $2, and the dollar was higher.